I would like now to introduce our next important panel, generating income from greenhouse gas offset credits. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panel sponsor, Nutrien, and our moderator for this panel, Michelle Nutting. Michelle, if you're there, I will just hand it directly over to you.
I'm here, Mary. Thanks very much. And just give me the thumb if the audio is good. All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's been able to join us today for this panel discussion. I'd like to thank you for your interest in this topic. My name is Michelle Nutting, and I am the Global Lead for Agriculture and Environmental Sustainability with Nutrien. I'm joining you virtually today from Calgary, Alberta. We are in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I would like to thank the Canadian Federation of Agriculture for giving Nutrien the opportunity to lead this panel discussion today. The format for the session is going to be short presentations from myself and our three panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. Each of us is going to cover a range of perspectives on the evolving landscape around generating income from carbon offsets. We're going to touch on Canada's proposed offset protocols to be developed, the systems and challenges for carbon credit trading, and some of the learnings and perspectives on carbon offsets from other jurisdictions. We'll also look to address how offset protocols can potentially improve Canada's long-term agricultural sustainability by rewarding farmers for improvements in soil organic carbon. So let me start first by introducing the three panelists that you'll hear from today. Our first panelist will be Judy Meltzer, the Senior Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Judy's going to be presenting on the development of carbon offset protocols in Canada, the context for a regulated market, and the engagement process for how the ag sector can be involved in the development process. The second panelist today will be Graham Gilchrist. Graham is the CEO for Biological Carbon Canada, and Graham will discuss what carbon offset credit trading may look like in Canada, as well as the challenges and opportunities experienced in other provincial jurisdictions. And our third panelist today will be Karn Manhas. Karn is the founder and CEO for Terramera. Karn will be presenting on Terramera's project on advanced methods for measuring soil carbon content in agricultural soils, and how it could potentially be used by farmers to verify carbon emission reductions. So we'll be using the chat box feature today for questions, and that chat box is going to be open after the presentations are finished. I'd like to take a few minutes now at the start of the presentation. So if I could get my slides set up, I would like to just talk a little bit about Nutrien's journey into the carbon market space. So thank you very much for presenting the slides for me. To talk a little bit about our journey as a company, we have entered into this developing carbon market space. Our entrance is looking like a pilot project launch that we have undertaken both in Canada and the US. And we will be working together with farmers to understand and develop agriculture's carbon market opportunity. If I could maybe have the next slide. What I'd like to really talk about is what is Nutrien's differentiated end-to-end carbon program. So for Nutrien, what we plan to be doing is building on existing protocols. And for us, that's particularly going to be the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol. And we're going to be working more broadly with collaborative groups to refine and shape those protocols for agriculture. Within Nutrien, we have assembled a kind of unique set of building blocks that are going to help deliver a carbon offset market opportunity and sustainable agricultural outcomes at scale. And that starts with that trust-based relationship that Nutrien's retail operations have with growers. So it all starts with planning, and planning how you're going to manage your acres to ensure that you have a good return on investment, along with having an eye to how to participate in a carbon market. The second phase is understanding what that grower-specific recipe for that farm looks like in terms of being able to participate in a carbon market. So what we know is that carbon protocols, carbon markets, require that you follow a certain set of practices or use management products that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase soil carbon sequestration. So that's a second component of Nutrien's end-to-end carbon program, is looking at all the practices, products, and services that will align to the protocols for carbon credit creation and deliver carbon value in addition to delivering return on investment for the growers. And in order to participate in a carbon marketplace, it's really important to have a documented, digitized plan that demonstrates not only the data that you're collecting, but the evidence of that practice establishment that's required to participate in a protocol for carbon markets. One of those components might be looking at variable rate prescriptions. Following for our nutrient stewardship, those practices are identified in the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol for reducing nitrous oxide emissions, and as a result of a reduced nitrous oxide emission, there is a carbon credit created. So having that support for the variable rate prescriptions and the documentation and the data that's required under a protocol is what ultimately turns into a carbon credit. And it's really important that we are working with these tools that farmers are already using today and understanding how we can streamline that data collection and turn that information and data into a validated outcome that produces a carbon credit. So I think that one of the areas we are looking to improve upon is within the current protocols, understanding the use of current technology and its ability to produce that data and evidence that validates an emission reduction has occurred on farmland. And then finally, having that monetization step. So that requires often the participation in a regulated market on a carbon registry. So there is a lot of service that can be provided from a data platform that allows growers to participate in the monetization of their carbon credits on a registry. And if I could just go to my last slide, please. So I wanted to talk about what the goal is in Nutrien's carbon journey, I guess. And for us, really the end game is to have a high quality carbon offset created. And whether that is participating in a compliance-based carbon market like Canada is envisioning, or a voluntary market, or a supply chain initiative, it's important that agriculture be able to produce a high quality carbon offset. And there's developed a consensus around what that core set of principles is. What makes a carbon offset high quality? And that's the aim, is really having an emission reduction that can be seen as real and credible. It's additional to the current practices. It's beyond business as usual. The carbon offset is permanent, such that any net reversals would be accounted for. And if there is a net reversal, that is replaced. And that carbon credit is also verified. So how do we participate in a third-party review of the monitoring, the data, and the evidence that's required in reporting? And finally, how do we enable farmers to participate in a registered carbon market, identifying the clear ownership of the carbon offset? And that's an important component so that there is tracking that avoids the double counting of carbon offsets. Some of these principles represent some challenges for agriculture, and I wanted to speak to a few of those. So the first principle of the carbon offset being seen as real requires that our method of calculating that offset is based on a known quantification method that's conservative, that's public and peer-reviewed, and based in science. And some of the challenges that that can present for agriculture are related to the use of new technologies and the underlying science that really supports that carbon emission reduction has occurred. So I think that there is a little bit of a science gap that we need to address in order to have protocols that are using quantification methods that are sensitive to the new practices or innovative products that farmers are able to use on their farms. And we just have to recognize that there is a gap there today and that it creates some uncertainty, and we'll have to deal with that uncertainty. The next kind of principle that I'd like to address is additionality. So in a carbon market, what a carbon buyer is looking for is a change, some action that has increased the amount of carbon sequestration or reduced the greenhouse gas emissions from the current levels today. And that additionality concept can be challenging in agriculture, where agriculture is a very technologically driven industry, and we have some real advanced practices that may not be well represented in terms of the science and the outcomes that they produce. And so how do we ensure that farmers who are already adopting advanced practices aren't left out of a carbon market opportunity? And I think that's an area that we want to discuss a little bit further today, is ensuring that we have a good understanding of how to incorporate farmers that are already really doing a good job in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and their ability to participate in a carbon market. And then there's the question of permanence and net reversals. And I think this is something that can be addressed in the design of a protocol. And it needs to recognize that decisions made by agricultural producers can be annual decisions. And that issue of a permanent reduction needs to be considered in the business context for agriculture and how decisions are made for management practices year on year. So with those kinds of, I guess, principles or guidelines, it produces some challenges for us. And I think one of the biggest challenges is this high data burden for being able to validate and verify the actions that are taken on farm, and that high cost of measurement that it addresses some of the variability in biological systems. That can lead to a bit of a discounting of the emission reductions that agriculture is benefited with. So we need some systems that help us address uncertainty and the discounting of greenhouse gas emission reductions from agriculture. And I think one of the ways that we'll be able to do that is to improve the digitization of agricultural information systems and allow it to be easier to use farm digital information in a protocol. So those are some of the challenges that I've seen. I'd like to get this panel presentation started and hand over the next session to Judy Meltzer with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I thank everybody for your interest, and hopefully I've prompted some questions from you. Judy, would you please like to address the group that we have assembled today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, we can move to the second slide. First, I'd just like to say thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here on this panel, and kudos to the CFA and its partners for pulling off a really effective virtual space to have this. So really delighted to be here and participate on this panel. I'm going to provide a fairly brief overview and update of the federal greenhouse gas offset system that we're in the process of developing. And happy to then, provide additional detail and more information and share more electronically subsequently if there's interest. So for context, I think many folks are aware, but we are in the process of developing a regulated federal greenhouse gas offset system as one piece of Canada's broader and now strengthened climate plan that was published in December of 2020. There are a whole host of measures and incentives and investments that are part of that plan, but my focus here for this panel is on the development of the federal greenhouse gas offset system. So first and foremost, I'd like to recognize that we're very aware of the critical role that Canadian farms play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether it be through conservation activities or adopting new management practices and technologies. And we recognize that is there is a significant and growing opportunity in that regard. The federal greenhouse gas offset system is intended to create opportunities in that space to earn revenue for greenhouse gas emissions reductions or removals for eligible projects. And in doing so, at the same time, help incent innovation as well as foster and stimulate additional private sector investment. And as was noted, offset credits, when we're referring to these refer to those credits generated from projects or activities that reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions, each credit representing 1 ton of CO2e. In terms of how credits are used under the federal system, so credits will be able to be sold to industrial facilities that are regulated under the federal carbon pricing system for industry, the output-based pricing system that is in place in different provinces and territories across the country since 2019. And they will use it as a compliance-based system insofar as they will be able to purchase and use eligible offset credits to help meet their own compliance obligations. We expect, although this is the primary purpose for creating a federal greenhouse gas offset system, we expect there will be other sources of demand for federal offset credits. So just a few examples could be in greening government initiatives at different levels of government, by private sector to meet emissions reduction targets, or requirements related to offsetting impacts, for example, in the context of resource development projects. So we do expect there to be sources of demand beyond the output-based pricing system for industry. Could we please move to the next slide? So I'd briefly like to just touch on some of the key design considerations as we develop the federal offset system. So first, the design is really informed by a piece of work that was done in 2017 and 2018 under the Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment. There was work done to develop a pan-Canadian offset framework, and this was joint work by the federal government as well as provincial and territorial governments, basically to outline best practices with respect to the design of offset systems. To help develop the design of the system at the federal level, we released subsequent to that 2 discussion papers outlining some of the design features that we were considering. The first was in June of 2019, and the second was last summer in July 2020. And we really we got a lot of input on some of the key system design features that were under consideration. And generally, as I should note that we're in the process of developing these, so we're still working on the design, and we'll be I'll give it a little update on the next steps on that front shortly. But basically, the federal system is intended to be national in scope and based on 3 broad principles. One, that reductions must occur in Canada. They must be complementary to existing climate policy and as administratively simple as possible. To generate a federal offset credit, projects must achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions that started after January 1st, or on or after, I should say, January 1st, 2017, This time frame basically serves as the equivalent of a baseline year for the system. These reductions or removals must be quantifiable, so they need to be based on a recognized federal offset protocol. And as was mentioned in the introductory remarks, protocols, these basically are those recipes that set out the consistent approach for quantifying reductions for specific types of projects. The reductions or removals must be additional to what would have occurred in the absence of an offset system, or as business as usual. They need to be verifiable. The reductions or removals need to be confirmed by a third party. The reduction also needs to be unique. And what we mean by this is that a project cannot generate credits in different systems for the same reduction. So this is to prevent the double counting of one reduction or removal in different sort of crediting systems. And also, reductions or sequestration of carbon must, of course, be permanent and endure over time. These design elements are fairly common to most offset systems. They're really important in the context of regulated compliance-based systems, such as the one that we're developing at the federal level. These reductions and the credits generated as a result, these are used in lieu of reductions that are made by a regulated industry under, in our case, the federal carbon pricing system. And so they really need to be robust and meet those criteria. But again, those are common design elements for most offset systems. Can we move to the next slide, please? So just with respect to development of protocols, so as mentioned, the federal offset protocols are going to be setting out a consistent approach for quantifying emissions reductions and removals for specific project types. We're going to be developing these on an ongoing basis, so this is an evergreen process. And we have recently signaled which ones we plan to develop first. One of the ones on the top of our list is a protocol for enhanced soil organic carbon. We are still in the early stages, but we expect this will include various sustainable agricultural land management activities that reduce emissions or enhance carbon sequestration. Again, details on the specifics of these practices and the protocol itself are still to be developed. But generally, as mentioned, we would expect activities would need to go beyond business as usual or common practice for activities not required by law or in regulations that aren't covered by carbon pricing or incented already, and again, have started on or after January 1st, 2017. We're very aware that there is a strong interest and opportunity to develop other agriculture sector protocols beyond enhanced soil organic carbon. And one of the next project types we're also considering for protocol development is for livestock feed management. And we will continue to look at additional project types over time in the future as more information or data becomes available. And this may include, for example, reduced nitrogen oxide emissions from fertilizers, as was mentioned, things like avoided conversion of grasslands, and potentially livestock manure management. So this is something where, as was noted, it'll be really, we're very interested and we'll keep a close eye on as some of the analysis and data and ability to quantify some of these continue to be developed. We could move briefly to slide 4. I'd just like to outline next steps in our development process. So we are in the process of developing the regulations. We're expecting that draft regulations will be published in Canada Gazette 1 this winter, so hopefully over the coming weeks. And we're targeting a final regulation in the fall of 2021. Just to note, the protocol development process is happening in parallel to the regulations. So the regulations will set out the broad framework, but the federal protocol development will be done in parallel. And we're hoping to initiate this in the spring of 2021. And we do plan to seek significant input, external input on the development of protocols. So we look forward to ongoing engagement on these. Certainly, of course, from other government departments, of course, including Agriculture Canada, but also external input from technical experts, from stakeholders, and other interested parties. So we're in the process of setting up a technical expert list, and we'll be able to provide, I won't go into the details now, but we can certainly provide more information on this process. And expect to, as I say, initiate this this spring. Maybe I should just note that a lot of detail in terms of how to apply to participate on protocol-specific technical expert teams is available on our website, as well as forms to be able to apply to participate in that process. So I recognize this has been a fairly quick overview, and so happy to provide some additional information, but definitely look forward to ongoing engagement. We think this is going to be a really important opportunity. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Judy. We should have coordinated presentations. We covered some same ground, but from some different perspectives. And I hope that folks are preparing their questions. And with that, I would like to now take the opportunity to turn our time over to Graham Gilchrist with Biological Carbon Canada. Graham, can you please speak to us on your perspectives regarding the carbon offset opportunity?
Michelle, thank you. And with the acknowledgement, I'm speaking here from Edmonton and Treaty 8. Folks, thank you. Just to remind everybody, we've been selling offsets in Alberta since '07. And we're creeping up on 17 million tons sold between farms here and our final emitters, and that's creeping up on about $295 million that has gone into Parkes before the basis and commission. So it is real money being sold. So next slide. So just to, sometimes I think this is ag policy, you know, the fact that we forget which way it's up, but to understand that this is a new commodity from the farm perspective, and we need to look at it this way. New slide. Some background and context, give you an idea. Thank you for some maps I put together, but this is where our emissions across Canada are coming from. As you note, certainly where people are traveling, but it gives you an idea of where Canada's emissions are coming from. Next slide. And the background to this is, if you look at this map, the orange is the density of agriculture in Canada. So you have give you a flavor of you know, certainly in Western Canada, the below Toronto, and then up the St. Lawrence River, and then into the Maritimes, gives you an idea of the density of both agriculture and forestry. So this plays an important part in what we're talking about. Next slide. But the other thing to realize is within our soil carbon, this is some work from Ag Canada, we also have changes in soil organic matter. A lot of it is dealing with the changes in farming practices, but there are certainly parts of this Canada that have increased over from 75 to 2015 in their soil organic matter and soil carbon, and other parts of Canada that are decreasing. And at the end of the day, we have to address this because it plays an important role. And if you go to the next slide. Healthy soil has a big impact then on your business health. It has a direct impact then on your profit margin, and has a direct impact on your sales. Next slide. But I certainly know as we're walking into this thing, we are dealing with some debates, and certainly over the last year, various folks have certainly commented on the tax and the change in the levy, and have been very vocal in dealing with this. So next slide. But give you a context. What you see here is coming out of the latest Environment Canada's report on emissions, and there's two things. One is the percentage of against Canada's total, and then we add in the sinks. So what you see over time is from the emission standpoint, we're fairly steady, or we're keeping track with Canada's total emissions. Once we add in the sinks, we've had a decrease till about 2011, and now those sinks are creeping back up. A lot of that's dealing with the conversion out of agriculture into urban development and literally taking away those sinks. Next slide. And as you can see here, this is the annual change. So we have been slowly decreasing over time, and then as you can see, when the dip starts to go up, we've had a positive point to our emissions for agriculture. Next slide. So if we break it down between agriculture production and our animals, our crops, and our on-farm fuel use and our sinks, that essentially I'm outlining here. This is what the report is telling us of what we've done for emissions, both on the sink side and then our emission side. Next slide. And if we break that down, then from Western Canada, you certainly, Alberta starting at the top, then Western Canada came up, and then it's now pretty steady at just over, the 20 million tons. Saskatchewan continues to rise. Manitoba and BC there at the bottom. If we move in the west, middle Canada, Ontario and Quebec, Quebec is slightly rising. Ontario seems to be fairly steady. And if we move into the Maritimes, with the exception of Newfoundland, overall the emissions in the Maritimes are decreasing. Next slide. And if we look at sources and sinks, this is just a quick look at animal production and crop production. The important thing here is crop production is slowly rising over time, and our animal production mirrors very nicely what's happening to our animal inventory. So next slide. From the cropping, next slide. So this is what's happening in Western Canada. You're certainly seeing increases on the crop side of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Same thing is happening in Middle Canada between Ontario and Quebec. And then when we also look at the Maritimes, we're up and down, but we are seeing a general increase over time that our emissions from crop production are slowly moving upwards. Next slide. Next slide. If we look at our on-farm fuel use, this is stationary, we are seeing certainly changes in Saskatchewan being the biggest one there, with Manitoba and BC there at the bottom. Ontario and Quebec, Ontario is up and down. Quebec is on the downturn, and then from the Maritimes, we're seeing a drop overall across those four provinces. Next slide. And if we look at animals and our animal production, next slide. We are seeing then essentially this is mirroring mainly our beef herd and our dairy herds across there, and you can see the spike in the middle of the 2000s with our highest animal production, and then we've decreased over time. And if you look at the Maritimes, they probably show the highest reduction from the 1990 area. So next slide. What's interesting is that even though the emissions are going down, the emissions per animal, this in the case of the enteric fermentation for our breeding cow herd, is going up per animal. And when we look at total emissions, this is both the enteric fermentation and the manure, we are seeing a drop in the total emissions, but we are seeing certainly an increase in the per breeding animal. So we have some interesting things behind the data. Next slide.
Graham, I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Oh boy. Okay, so I'll speed up. Next slide. We'll just move on here. I think the biggest question though is are we going to bend the curve in the report, or are we going to bend the farm curve? And so if we go to the next slide. Next slide. There are 4 markets that we've got to deal with, and we've touched on them a bit. We've got a regulated market, volunteer, and setting investment. Next slide. So this is dealing with either serialized offset for a certificate. We're moving into the volunteer market. We're into the greenhouse gas footprinting, and we're dealing with direct buying or cherry selling. Next slide. So we have some challenges, and the next 4 set of slides outline those. So from the science gaps, we've touched on a bit, but we have to separate outcomes between management and the environment, and we're going to have to deal with the principles Michelle laid out of uncertainty and accuracy. Next one. What's happening, though, is all 4 of those markets, we need market rules. And that certainly currently in the legislative framework is missing. Why this is important is that the price has to absorb the uncertainty if we don't have these rules in place. Next slide. We need the protocols. This is the place where the good science, the technology comes together with an output. And that output then outlines what is being guaranteed behind the certificate of what's being traded, regardless of what market you're in. Next slide. And lastly, we're going to have to deal with the haircuts. What I mean by this is we have to quit leaving as an industry the outcomes on the table. So this means instead of absorbing management reversals, we're going to have to deal with issues around essentially penalizing those that do it. The potential, and I'll just go quickly through a set of slides here. Next slide. Next slide. So I've talked about these 4 commodity opportunities. So next slide. But interesting, this is the farm in 2019. As you can see, there are heating fuel and machinery fuel are a part of the overall cost complex of today's farming community. Next slide. So where this is important is we did the work for Industry Development Canada of a supercluster, and we still believe there's about 194 million tons we can generate. And if we look at with the current pricing model that the government has laid out, that's about $560 million we think we can capture. So if we take some of these monies and go to the farm balance sheet and income statement, if you go to the next slide, there's a couple of things to be aware of. The offset market will have an impact on the revenue side. If we look at some of the things that's being talked about of trying to keep 30% more of your fertilizer that you bought, put broadcasting as an example, there is another change in your gross margin. If you look at some of the research and taking a hard look at your on-farm fuel use and trying to lower your essentially your use of diesel and natural gas, there's another savings there. So depending on where you want to attack this, you're going to have a change in your margins on the farm side. Last couple of slides, Michelle. Did a little work, and this is the carbon value of the announcement that came off for Christmas. So at $35.30 is the value per ton for CO2e. If we can capture all of the funds and convert them to marketable products and changes on the on-farm. Last slide. So I'll leave this as, please don't shout. You got to bring receipts to the game in order to prove that you're doing what you're set out to do. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Michelle.
Graham, thank you so much. I do appreciate the in-depth analysis that you gave us, some real concrete numbers for us to think about. And we probably could have had half an hour just for your slides alone, but I think hopefully this is going to stir some great questions from the audience. And if you're thinking of those and starting to note them down, I'd appreciate that. While you're doing that, I'd like to turn over our presentation next to Karn Manhas. Karn is the CEO and founder of Terramera. And Karn, I'd love to hear your perspectives on the generating carbon credits for agriculture and participating in the offset space. Karn, please take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited and to talk about this. And congratulations to the CFA to bring this topic so central and forward. I think it's one of the key issues that we will have that will really evolve and support Canadian agriculture. So just when the slides come up, just give it a quick moment. As we wait for those, I'll just also acknowledge that I'm speaking from Vancouver, and the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. While we're waiting for those to come up, I'll just give a quick background on myself and Terramera. So my background is in biology and government law. Terramera was founded from an argument I had while I was at UBC. So we've been around about 11 years now. We're focused on how we can use technology to transform how we grow food and the economics of agriculture. We're currently a team of about 130 people. We've been growing quite fast, especially in the last 4 years, with about 110 of the team here in Canada, of which the majority of us, the majority is almost 80 are in research and development, divided between scientists, biologists like myself, chemists, agronomists, and hardware and software engineers. Next slide. Oh, we missed. We can go to slide 2 just for a moment. The company holds over 250 patents worldwide. We are in the business of what we call computational agriculture for clean food, which we use to answer our core question. You can keep it on this slide. I will catch up to you. Our core question is, how can we use technology to unlock the intelligence in nature to ensure an earth that thrives and provides for everyone? So we apply those technologies to the service of our 3 audacious goals, which you see in front of you today. I'm going to talk most about our technology to quantify soil carbon sequestration that supports all 3 of these. And as Graham just mentioned, soil health equals business health, and we'll continue to learn about that. So next slide, please. So we have several problems in agriculture today. First, there's a lot of inefficiency from loss from pests and disease to runoff and others. Next slide. But Canada has an incredible agricultural sector, one of the world's largest, but we can improve it through the use of technology and increasing per acre efficiency. If we look to small countries like the Netherlands as an example of what's possible, we can actually do even better than that. Next slide. So profitability is a huge concern. Even before COVID, Canadian producer income, farm gate income dropped over 55% since 2017. It's an issue that I think is not appreciated well enough. Next slide. But there are major opportunities in agriculture, and agriculture is too often really focused on as a net contributor to climate change and GHG emissions, but it actually has one of the largest opportunities to be a major part of the solution, both economic and climate, in terms of leveraging soils and leveraging Canadian farmlands for their carbon sequestration potential. Next slide. So agriculture is a natural carbon sink. The technology of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis. So the more plants are able to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, this naturally happens in agriculture, the more carbon that gets pulled into the soil. If we can keep more of it in the soil each year than we lose, we can both turn back the clock on climate change and at the same time make farming much more profitable and efficient. Next slide. So as Michelle was talking about, Nutrien, as you heard, is already investing in making this a reality and is estimating soil carbon sequestration can be a $100 billion opportunity that can add up to $50 per acre of value to farmers in new cash margins. Next slide. So what's the potential here in Canada? Canada has 160 acres of farmland. If we can mobilize on this across all of our nation's farms, that could mean somewhere between 1.6 to 8 billion tons of carbon sequestered in agriculture, which could help Canada exceed its Paris commitments and profitably take us to net negative carbon territory. That could mean tens of billions of dollars of new revenue to Canadian producers, while making Canadian farms more productive and profitable. Next slide. So what's standing in the way of wider adoption? There are several barriers that we need to build beyond. And Michelle talked about a couple of the very critical ones which we're trying to solve. So number one, the uncertainty in the system to validate and verify and quantify what's happening in the soil, and the high cost. We see that's the number one biggest issue, to understand and quantify the amount of soil of carbon that there is, how much is in the ground in each acre, and how much is in the ground after we start taking soil regenerative activities, how much carbon has actually changed on that acre. So even if farmers had better regenerative agronomy supports to know what to do, we still aren't sure how much carbon there's still too much uncertainty about how much carbon those activities are actually resulting in sequestering in the ground per acre. So, and right now taking physical measurements is way too expensive and can't scale. And the models that are being used are seen by many as not reliable, and accuracy continues to be an issue. Next slide, please. So that's where Terramera comes in. We've developed capabilities to see inside plants, track inputs, and also track and quantify molecules in plants like sugar and protein content in plants real time without requiring physical or destructive sampling, and see and learn what's happening using computational chemistry paired with machine learning and AI. And we're applying that capability to track and quantify carbon in soil to really understand what is happening under the soil, to model and quantify soil carbon and therefore soil health. Next slide. So we've developed technology that can cheaply, easily, and reliably quantify soil carbon. We'll be working with farmers on that test. And over these years, our goal is to drive the cost down. Right now, the cost of physical verification is extremely expensive, as many of you who may have engaged in this know, costs thousands, many thousands of dollars. Our goal is to drive the cost of reliable quantification down below $5 per acre. Next slide. So we will be rolling this out and working with producers on the first 300,000 acres starting this year. So this is something that we'll be talking more about and announcing more formally, but we'll be starting to onboard the first 10,000 acres this year, likely starting in the Peace River area of BC and possibly Alberta. These pilots will be funded to drive value to the producers involved, and we have some major commercial partnerships we will be announcing soon, so stay tuned to that. And if you are interested, or producers you know may be interested, you can sign up online using the link that's there, regenerativeag.terramera.com, and click the tab for farmers. There will be a link there, and we'll begin qualifications in coming months. So for these pilots, we'll be looking for producers that are willing to be fairly involved and give feedback on the program and the technology and the experience to improve it as we go on. So if you have any trouble or questions, you can also just email me or email us. Next slide. So we believe that technology can be a force for good, and focusing on incomes, incomes and outcomes, but focusing on outcomes paired with good agronomic supports is really what's needed to unleash the intelligence and entrepreneurship of producers to decide what's best to do on their land and be rewarded for their actual results. We have a real opportunity here with focusing on outcomes and regenerative practices that drive both economic results and sustainability results, and really take away some of the divide between areas of agriculture, because regenerative practices can be used no matter what kind of agricultural practice a producer follows. It's able to be used on all of them, and really start focusing on actual results. So we really appreciate the CFA's work, partnership, and advocacy on behalf of Canadian producers to that end, and we'll continue to work with the CFA and you to support that as we optimize, build, and roll out these tools. Thank you.
Karn, thank you so much for your presentation, and I found it really interesting that both of us are piloting, entering into the journey, seeking solutions, hoping to provide some suggestions and opportunities that can enable better protocol implementability that is responsive to the technology options that farmers are able to use today. So lots of challenges, lots of questions. We have questions. I am hoping that the audience also has questions. So first of all, let me thank Judy, Graham, and Karn for really a stimulating presentation. And I think that at this point, the chat box should be open. We'd like you to put your name and organization into the chat box along with your question, and also identify who you would like to direct that question to. And if we get a lot of questions, and I hope we do, we will try and answer those questions even after the panel session is completed. So with that, I believe I should hear from Matt Houston if we have some questions already in the queue, or I might be mistaken about who's letting us know about the questions. But let me just check in with our CFA hosts and see where we're at with questions right now.
Yeah, we have a few questions from the floor. The first one is from Bill Campbell from Keystone Agriculture Producers, and he's asking it to Graham. And he asks, can you comment on the increased emissions in Western Canada relative to the increased production? Wouldn't it be a better comparison to include production relative to greenhouse gas emission?
Good question. That is the packaging answer. The data is coming right out of the report, and it is the hard numbers as reported by Canada. We are seeing, though, various institutions, Dairy Farmers of Canada is a good example, that are packaging both their greenhouse gas changes and their production levels to show, an efficiency coefficient. So that question really is around not so much a smokestack pollution level, but if you start to look at that type of metric, that metric then at the farm level gives you a measure of efficiency, well, positive or negative, and then from a farm management decision, which way do you want the emissions to go in order to drop the top number, and if you're moving the bottom number up with your production, then you continue to benchmark where you are and where you want to go to.
Thanks very much, Graham. Let's have our next question, please.
Okay, the next question is from Andy Kuyvenhoven, and it is to Judy. And he's asking, changing tractors and other diesel-driven equipment to electric, would that qualify as a reduction protocol?
Hi, sorry, it took me a moment to find my to unmute. Thanks for that question. I mean, I guess my first response is we're still at the early stage of developing protocols, and so we've identified the ones that we're going to move out to develop first. But that's a question we're going to come back to you to respond. Again, I mean, key considerations just generally will be that it's additional to business as usual. One of the things to note in particular for this example would be that if shifts or the practice is already incented, for example, by carbon pricing itself, then that would mean that it wouldn't necessarily be additional. And of course, verifiability and permanence. So maybe a little bit unsatisfactory, but we'll come back to you in details of which specific activities and project types. Generally speaking, when it's a shift away from fuel, those are typically covered by pricing, but of course that can vary in the agriculture sector depending on different systems in place across the country. So we'll come back to you on that, but appreciate the question.
Thanks, Judy. Can we have the next question, please?
Yes, the next question is from Peter from Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance. He's asking this to Judy. He's asking, should federal greenhouse gas offset programs include expertise from the seafood farming sector to show that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration benchmarks are more realistic for our food production sector?
Thank you for that question. Again, we're planning, and I should have been clear about this in my outline of next steps. So what we expect to do is to develop dedicated technical expert teams for each type of project and activity, and so for each protocol. So we hope to get expertise and input for the relevant sector. I would just encourage anybody who is interested, and I will share the link through the CFA and Frank afterwards. I'd encourage you to take a look at the application form that provides a little bit more detail on kind of the roster of experts. But we hope to have again an evergreen roster of experts that we can draw upon over time. So a little bit early in where we're at to be able to give a definitive answer on that one, but definitely looking for expertise across a range of sectors, but relevant to the specific protocol.
Thanks, Judy. And our next question?
The next question is from Ron Maynard from the P.Ag Federation of Agriculture, and it's a grant. How will the federal program match with the present Alberta program of carbon offsets?
Can you repeat that?
Is how will the federal program match with the present Alberta program of carbon offset?
That's a very good question. The Alberta protocols with tillage are expiring at the end of 2021. So that's probably a disconnect. They are both designed the same, so they're both using the ISO principles. So as protocols get developed anywhere in Canada under those systems, then in theory, as Judy has laid out, they will become fungible between a producer in PEI and an emitter in Alberta, as an example. But the key, I think, to answer your question, is the protocols, whether provincially based in your neck of the woods or in my neck of the woods, all have to go through that approval process for you to then transact against those principles.
Can I just jump in on that question, just to add, Graham and Michelle?
Yeah.
It's a good question, and that's right. And just to add from the federal lens in terms of that question around fungibility. So, before we began to develop a federal offset system, we wanted to be able to recognize eligible offset credits that were in existing systems. We know that jurisdictions like Alberta, BC, and Quebec have been, working in this space for a really long time. And so the industries under the federal output-based pricing system can use the eligible offset credits that are identified in provincial systems. And again, we post this on a list for compliance. And then maybe more to the point of the question, where the federal carbon pricing system applies, the system for industry, so currently including in Manitoba and part in Saskatchewan, in PEI, and currently still in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nunavut in the Yukon, wherever that industrial facility can purchase a federal credit, will be able to use a federal credit from wherever it's generated across the country. So the federal system is national in scope, even though the pricing system for industry is a backstop approach, so it doesn't apply in all jurisdictions. Again, happy to follow up and provide some additional information.
Thanks very much, Judy. So I'm seeing we have about 2 minutes left for questions, and I'll just check to see if we have an additional question or two from the floor. And I know that I myself have a list of questions in case we don't, but to the floor to see if we have other questions.
Yes, we do. This one is from Chris Vandenhoevel, and it is for Karn. Says, your last statement said farmers should be compensated based on results, regardless of farming practices, such as organic versus conventional. The problem is how we get government to recognize that the use of biotechnology can be just as effective as organic practices when the public seems to think the opposite.
Thanks for the question, Chris. So, I think we've for a long time wanted to move towards outcomes-based results. I think that the technology hasn't been in place to be able to do that. I think the proxy for that has been used is sets of beliefs around what one type of practice is doing to the field or to the soil versus another practice. I think what we need to be able to do is use hard data and find out what is actually happening. So if GMO, for example, it has a real potential to be able to be used to develop crops that actually pull more carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. That's something that we need to be looking at doing. And if we can show with data that is actually increasing the amount of carbon that is being sequestered into the soil, I think we have a much stronger case to be able to show that is that's something that should be compensated for based on the results. We need to be able to have the technology that shows the data so that we're making decisions based on results, and compensation is also based on results.
Thanks very much, Karn. I really appreciate that last question regarding technology and having protocols that can be inclusive of new technology. That's going to be a big challenge because we have to have the underlying science to demonstrate the impact. And I think, Judy, I don't envy your job. There is going to be a lot of technical experts that are available to weigh in and participate in your stakeholder engagement and technical expert committees to help develop this. And there's a lot of questions and challenges. I would just like to acknowledge the expertise and the sharing of each of our panel members today, and thank everybody very much for your contributions. I'm sure that we have a long list of questions that we were not able to get to on the call, so I thank everyone for bringing your questions, and we have been told that we will get the questions, and as panelists, we will do our best to provide answers back to you. There is a lot of work in this very evolving and developing space to undertake, and I think there's a place for everybody to participate. So I'm very encouraged by what I heard today, the level of expert knowledge that we have in Canada, and I'd like to thank the Canadian Federation of Agriculture for giving us the opportunity today to explore some of these issues with you. With that, I'll turn it back to our hosts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to Nutrien for sponsoring, and to our panelists. There was a lot of work put into your presentations, and we certainly appreciate your expertise, your dedication, and the time you put into making this such a great panel.